understanding how Gandhi could be relevant in the present century, especially in dealing with the issue of terrorism.
Critics that Gandhi would say no, violence is never necessary in responding to violence or terrorism.
So Gandhi was not exactly a philosopher of peace, but he was a philosopher of war, peaceful war.
The way the state is organized is in itself has a structural bias towards certain section of population.
Gandhi emphasized more on conflict transformation rather than on conflict resolution. Hello everyone. I, Priya Sharma, research scholar from Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, on behalf of Foundation for Creative Social Research, welcome you all to the first session of our dialogue series on nonviolence and terrorism in the 21st century.
Foundation for Creative Social Research, or FCSR, is an initiative by a group of scholars and activists which aims to evolve a discursive community to bring forth theoretical perspectives from the vantage point of the marginalized. The foundation seeks to promote researchers in imagining new fields of study. It helps in raising funds for this purpose and developing networks of scholars and activists for sharing their intellectual and social concerns. It supports many initiatives by forming working groups to facilitate discussion, research, and publications by members on various themes.
This series focuses on understanding how Gandhi could be relevant in the present century, especially in dealing with the issue of terrorism. It analyzes the possibilities of a non-violent strategy to achieve those goals that are being tried to be met through a violent means by terrorists today. Some of the questions that it aims to cover are as follows. How would Gandhi respond to terrorism? Or would Gandhi have responded to terrorism at all? What kind of strategies, lines of thought, and objectives would non-violent responses encapsulate? How terrorism breaks harmony between mind, body, and soul? How to unveil the deep-rooted power relations that manipulate societies, organizations, and states to sustain violence in every form? How to not dehumanize, alienate, and demonize those involved overtly or covertly in the entire web of terrorism and state violence. To discuss further with us, today we have Dr. Douglas Allen as our guest speaker.
Dr. Douglas Allen had been a professor of philosophy at University of Maine, United States of America, and retired as Professor Emeritus of Philosophy in 2020. Professor Allen is often recognized as one of the world's leading scholars in phenomenology of religion and the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. He has authored and edited 5 Gandhi-informed books, including Gandhi After 9/11, Creative Nonviolence, and Sustainability. He is a Gandhian scholar in both his thought and action. A peace and justice scholar activist, Professor Douglas Allen has been an active member in civil rights movement, Vietnam anti-war movement, anti-apartheid movement, and many other struggles resisting violence, war, class exploitation, imperialism, racial and gender oppression, and environmental destruction. He was the founder and has been an active member of Maine Peace Action Committee and served as education coordinator of the Peace and Justice Center of Eastern Maine. He has been a recipient of Hands of Peace Award in Maine and the Scroll of Peace International Award for Peace Research in India. We are very grateful to have you with us, sir.
To moderate this session, we have Dr. Manindranath Thakur, Member, Foundation for Creative Social Research and Associate Professor at Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Dr. Thakur has been persistently working on understanding Gandhi's relevance in the contemporary world, and his idea of ethical realism is one of his most important articulations. From our organizing team, we have Mr. Abhay Punjabi and Ms. Vipanchika Sahashri, Master Student in Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Without further ado, I would request Dr. Allen to present his views on nonviolence and terrorism.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to do this program on nonviolent philosophy and practice responding to terrorism. Is violence ever necessary? And we're just approaching India's Independence Day, 15 August. And last month we had US, America's Independence Day, July 4th. And I was thinking with regard to the topic, how different the dominant narratives are in the two societies. I had the honor of being invited by the Gandhi Research Foundation in Jalgaon to give the keynote on 15 August 2013. And I devoted the whole keynote to comparing and contrasting July 4th and 15 August, and what the dominant narratives are, and the ritualized celebratory practices. And there are a lot of commonalities. Both involved independence from British colonialism. But with regard to our topic of violence, nonviolence, terrorism, there are great differences that may come out today. In terms of the title, the quick answer is that Gandhi critics would say yes. In responding to terrorism, is violence ever necessary? Yes, it is. And then they would respond that M.K. Gandhi says no, violence is never necessary. And that is why in responding to terrorism today, Gandhi, for critics, is irrelevant. When it comes in a more interesting way to Gandhi's supporters, including most in India, my experience is that supporters agree with critics that Gandhi would say, no, violence is never necessary in responding to violence or terrorism. And in fact, Gandhi gives us the perfect solution, the blueprint for how to respond to terrorism, but unfortunately, we do not listen. And that's why we have so much violence and terrorism in the world today. My own approach is that Gandhi is the most important proponent of nonviolence in the contemporary world. I'm strongly influenced by a Gandhi-informed approach. And I agree that well over 90% of the time, Gandhi would say that in our response to violence and terrorism, violence is not necessary. Nevertheless, what is more interesting for me is Gandhi grants that there are extreme cases in which we uphold the ideals, the absolute ideals of ahimsa, of nonviolence, of truth. But violence may, in fact, be necessary. But when it is necessary, Gandhi tells us we must uphold a philosophy, the moral, spiritual, economic, political, social, and other contextualized qualifications that separates a Gandhian approach, even in these extreme cases, from almost all other endorsements of the necessity for violence. So there are a lot of topics relevant to this, to our major topic today, on nonviolent philosophy and practice responding to terrorism. Is violence ever necessary? Let me just outline a few, and then the commentators may want to ask questions or challenge even some of my perspective, and I welcome that. So I've done a lot of work comparing 9/11 in the United States, the 9/11 2001 terrorism, and the 26/11 2008 terrorism in Mumbai. And so I've done a lot of work comparing them, and whether in fact a Gandhi-informed approach is completely irrelevant in dealing with such terrorism. And I was there in India weeks after the 26/11, and I was asked to give a keynote on the spot, change my topic as to whether Gandhi's irrelevant. And then I had a Fulbright, and I spent the whole next year in India working on that topic. So part of the approach that I have to our topic is the necessity, which I'll try to do briefly, to define and to clarify what we mean by terrorism. Because it's a very vague term. And then to get into and how terrorism is related to violence and terror and nonviolence. And then to talk about, I've discussed at length whether for something to be formulated as terrorism, whether there has to be an intentional terrorist structure of consciousness, how Gandhi's different approach towards violence and terrorism greatly broadens and deepens how we approach those topics. A lot of confusion about Gandhi's view on violence and suffering as necessary for creative, transformative nonviolence, in terms of self-purification, self-discipline, self-suffering. The difference between voluntary and involuntary suffering. I've done a lot of work on economic violence because, again, there's a lot of misconceptions. My experience, my first formative year in Benares, I was very fortunate to study under several of the most famous philosophers in India, famous Vedantists, Shankaracharyans, and to meet with really remarkable yogis and spiritual masters. And the general approach there was that the economic violence was devalued, marginalized, or completely ignored, right? As part of the world of Maya, the world of illusion that we had to spiritually transcend. For me, this is not Gandhi or not my approach. There's a lot of work on Gandhi and terrorists. Gandhi himself not only experienced terrorism, but he had a lot of engaged dialogue with, especially with Indian terrorists. And there's much to learn there. Of course, Gandhi's famous means-ends analysis is key to our topic of violence and nonviolence and terrorism. And there's a lot of insight there in Gandhi's means-ends famous analysis. And Gandhi's, in that regard, his preventative approach, how to get at the root causes, the basic conditions that give rise to violence and terrorism, and also in terms of whether Gandhi may have a long-term transformative perspective, but what does he do about short-term violence and terrorism as seen on 9/11, 26/11, people engaged in rape, menacing monkeys, and other examples of short-term explosive violence. And finally, I've done a lot of work on the key distinction often ignored between absolute truth and relative truth, and how that relates, how we can contextualize that in dealing with violence and terrorism in the world today in very complex, nuanced, often contradictory ways. Okay. And finally, how we can relate to the other in a Gandhi-informed and other approaches in which the other is othered, either as victims of either as terrorists or as victims of terrorism, and how Gandhi inverts our dominant Western orientation of the primacy of the self and the problematic nature of relating to the other that defines so much of modern civilization, and I would say dominant narratives in India today as well. So let me, I think what would be very helpful would be to clarify a few key terms. And in terms of our topic, terrorism, violence, nonviolence, what I find is I've looked at after 9/11 and then more recently, I've looked at a lot of the literature on this. For example, the US Code of Federal Regulations has clear formulations on what is terrorism. The US State Department has a joint communication entitled Anti-Terrorism, in which it refers to definitions in the Department of Defense, the military, and others. And I've looked at other formulations, UN, international, and other formulations of this. What I might say in terms of my approach, many of these definitions of terrorism for me are too narrow. For example, many of them just define terrorism as illegal, an illegal act of violence and so forth. And so to me, that is too narrow because what it would mean in that analysis, for example, is that you could not define the Nazis in the 30s, Hitler, their policies as being terrorists because it was legal. Or I did a lot of work in South Africa, anti-apartheid struggle. That would mean one would have to accept that definition that Washington had also, that the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela were terrorists, and you could not define the apartheid regime, whose measures were technically legal, as terrorist. Or in the United States, that would mean, for example, that the slave policies, the segregation policies, all of that institutionalized racism, which was legal, could not be defined as terrorist. So for many of that and many other reasons, I find many of the definitions of terrorism are too narrow. And on the other hand, some of them are just too vague, right? They're too general, they're too vague. It's basically the other, who we define as other, and who in some way we see as threatening us, is the terrorist. So I think we have to, in many ways, be much more specific. And here are a few ways I try to do it. First of all, terrorism is always violent. It's always violent. But most violence is not terrorism. If you look at basic definitions of violence, they usually have two main features. One is violence is an action, a policy that is rough, immoderate, fierce, intense. But in that regard, there's no inherent negative judgment. Many who use that definition say, yes, and such violence is necessary. And the second definition, it tends to be pejorative, negative, that violence involves harm, the sense of injury in terms of himsa. It involves violation, assault, oppression, injustice. Okay. And in my approach, you have both senses, and especially the second. So what we find is that terrorism always involves violence, but maybe 99% of violence is not terrorism, right? There are all kinds of other violence that are not, one cannot define as terrorism. Secondly, you get a term terror. Terrorism always involves terror, the infliction of fear, uncertainty, insecurity, dread, usually on civilian populations, right? And terrorism always involves the infliction of terror, which is terror is always violent, right? Most violence is not terror, but terror is always violent, okay? But in my approach, terror is, again, a more general term than terrorism. There are many forms of terror that we don't want to define as terrorism. Terrorism always involves violence and terror, but most terror is not terrorism. For example, you can feel terror about your existential situation in the world, your sense of mortality, anxiety. You may feel terror about your situation of poverty, of oppression, of attempting to survive. But that usually does not result in terrorism. For example, you may blame yourself, right? You may turn to religion. Things will be better in the next world. Things will be better in the next life. And there, you may turn to alcoholism, to drugs, there are all kinds of resources you can have to try to deal with the terror, the anxiety, the dread you feel without turning to terrorism. So terrorism always involves violence. It always involves terror. But what is the specific formulation I have of terrorism? So for me, terrorism consists of policies and actions, usually intentional, that use explicit violence or implicit forms of violence or threats of violence, economically, militarily, psychologically, politically, culturally, religiously, primarily directed against civilian populations in order to terrorize or inflict extreme fear and insecurity as a means of achieving political and other objectives or goals. Okay, so that's how I will use terrorism. And then, so let me then say, in that regard, in my approach, greatly informed in a selective, creative way by the primary example of Gandhi, Gandhi greatly deepens and broadens our understanding of violence and corresponding nonviolence, terrorism, and how we can respond to terrorism and whether violence is ever necessary. Okay, in my work, Gandhi does this in two main ways, just very briefly. Most of us would say we're against violence easily. Most of us, of course, would say we're against terrorism. 99% of people would say that. But in Gandhi's approach, most of us, in fact, are part of the problem, not the solution. And we either perpetuate or we're complicit with, or we allow ongoing violence and terrorism. How can Gandhi say this? For Gandhi, most of us, when we say we're against violence and terrorism, we restrict this to overt, usually physical examples. I'm against torture. I'm against people killing people, exploding bombs, right? Crashing planes into the World Trade Center, shooting people in this train station and the hotels and other places in Mumbai. I'm against rape. I'm against bullying and so forth, okay? And that's important. In fact, Gandhi was killed by an act of overt physical violence and terrorism. But for Gandhi, this is a very small part of overall violence, terror, and hence terrorism. So how does Gandhi broaden and deepen? First, in the work I've done, I've used two main formulations. One is that Gandhi adopts this position of the multi-dimensionality of violence, and hence terrorism. For Gandhi, violence is multidimensional. In addition to overt physical violence, we have psychological violence, inner violence. Hatred is violence for Gandhi. In addition, we have linguistic violence. As Gandhi repeatedly shows, language can be a very oppressive, controlling, shaming, domineering way that is violent. Gandhi talks about, I spent more time on economic violence than any other form of violence, which is unusual for such a great moral force. For me, Gandhi is mainly a moral exemplar and spiritual force. Gandhi talks about how he uses violence interchangeably with exploitation. He often says poverty is the worst form of violence. For Gandhi, in economic violence, we have this hierarchical distinction between the economic haves and have-nots, the people who own and control the means of production, the factories, the resources, the labor of others, the media. They are able to use their economic power, right, to dominate, to control, to exploit, to oppress the have-nots. In fact, that's why Gandhi economically is such a radical egalitarian, right? So in addition, you have cultural violence, political violence. Gandhi wrote at great length about religious violence, environmental violence. Gandhi has. So what Gandhi says, all of these dimensions of violence interact, mutually reinforce each other, so that we become entrapped in endless means-end cycles of violence. The other key notion in Gandhi that I bring out is the structural violence of the status quo. This is business as usual that we usually do not even recognize as violent. Gandhi says when the dominant economic, political, social, cultural, religious, caste, class, and environmental and sort of system, military system, state system is working smoothly without disruption, this is very violent. In fact, we need to disrupt the normal status quo functioning of the violent system. So when you combine the multidimensionality of violence with the structural violence of the status quo, you can see how this greatly deepens and broadens our approach in how we can respond to the question of nonviolent philosophy and practice relating to terrorism and whether violence is ever necessary. So you see, in the analysis that I try to present, in addition to thinking of terrorism in terms of overt actions of individuals, of groups, of certain militant Islamists, of what happened on 9/11, what happened on 26/11, and so many other examples you could give today from in India and all around the world and in the United States. In addition to all of that, in my response, we have to talk about things like corporate terrorism, right? Which is structurally, relationally constituted in all the ways that meet my definition of terrorism. We have to talk about capitalist, globalized terrorism. We have to talk about environmental terrorism. We have to, in other words, in which not a few thousand people die, but hundreds of millions of human beings die suffer and die every year from humanly caused and preventable violence, oppression, and injustice. So, because of time, let me just say how, granting some of that framework, and it's related to many of the other topics I mentioned, okay, how does Gandhi respond to the most extreme difficult cases in which there don't seem to be any nonviolent alternatives that are viable, that can be effective, such as on 9/11, on 26/11, people are actually being shot, they're being killed. There's no opportunity for Gandhi-informed dialogue, communication. If you say to the terrorist, kill me, I'm willing, they'll just kill you and then keep killing everyone else. So how do you respond to these? How do you respond to the mentally unstable or enraged person who's actually shooting students in schools, right? And so there's so many examples in Gandhi's writings that we could give. So here's how I try to give a more nuanced, complex Gandhian response to our question. Namely, 98% of the time that we have violence and we're responding to terrorism, there are alternatives. There are nonviolent alternatives. This is not a last resort. There are things preventative things we could do. We could change the dialogue long-term, even short-term, to try to diffuse, decenter the situation, to try to remove the basic causes and conditions that have given rise to the terrorism and the response, the terroristic responses. However, what about those extreme cases, that's 1% of the time, where the violence is just exploding and where there seems to be no nonviolent Gandhian or other alternative? So finally, here is how I try to deal with that question. I say what Gandhi would say is, in those extreme cases where we have no nonviolent alternative to the terrorism, violence, the use of violence may be necessary. That may be the most nonviolent thing we can do, right? To save lives and so forth. To stop the terrorist from their act of terrorism. However, when we do that, we do not take the approach that most people do in glorifying such violence. What we say is what we do is not glorious. It's not glorious, it's tragic. It's a sign of human failure that we have not developed our nonviolent capacity and nonviolent relations and structures in the world, that in fact, we are reduced to the situation in which we have no viable option right now. So what we do is, because we still maintain our absolute ideal, our absolute goal and values of nonviolence, this informs how we respond to that terrorism with violence. For example, it is a last resort, not a first resort. We don't glorify it. We limit the intensity and duration of our violence to the minimum necessary to stop the terrorism, right? And most importantly, we do everything possible then to change the basic root causes, the basic economic, social, cultural, religious, and other relations and conditions that gave rise to that terrorism, so that we don't repeat and become trapped in endless cycles of terrorism, of violence and terrorism. So to me, that's where Gandhi has a lot to say. The work I did in India was often with the police chief in Mumbai, with certain terrorist experts. And when you grant that, they're willing to engage you in dialogue. They're interested. They don't simply dismiss a Gandhian approach as irrelevant. So I'll just end by saying that for me, in terms of our topic, nonviolent philosophy and practice responding to terrorism, is violence ever necessary? Gandhi is indispensable in dealing with our contemporary world of violence and terrorism, but Gandhi is a catalyst. Gandhi constantly challenges us. Gandhi is not perfect. He's a remarkable human being, but a flawed human being. He does not have the perfect blueprint that we can just impose on any situation of violence and terrorism in our world today. But if we have in a Gandhian spirit, if we are willing to engage in dialogue, to be open to other perspectives, non-Gandhian perspectives and points of view, and to struggle. And it's an ongoing dynamic struggle to try to reformulate, reconstitute, reapply a Gandhian informed perspective. That gives us our best hope for how to deal with our serious contemporary crises of violence and terrorism in the world today. So I look forward to your comments, questions, and challenges.
Thank you, Professor Allen. Thank you for a wonderful short summary of what you have written in this wonderful book. And I must congratulate for the book that you have written. As the title is attractive, but more attractive is the content of the book. And you will be glad to know that a lot of young Indian students are interested in engaging with the points that you have raised. You can see these two young students doing their PhD. Priya is doing her PhD. She wrote her MPhil on this theme, and now she's doing her PhD on the similar theme. And Vipanchika is thinking about so many things, not only about Palestine-Israel issues, but also about anti-prison movement. And this is actually being quite Gandhi informed in a way. So we must congratulate you for doing such a wonderful work. Let me get back to your point that you have raised very squarely. I think this is a wonderful point that there is a multi-dimensionality of violence. So Gandhi gives us an idea that it is not only the violence that we see as violence, which is visibly to us when real physical harm is done, but there are also structure of violence. There are structural violences, and there are many actors in this violence, not only those who use guns or the state which is using police force, but also you have given this burden on us too, that each one of us probably have not really thought about ourselves being violent. And so we have a tendency to become violent as human beings. So it's a multidimensionality, no doubt about it. There are two strategies that you suggested. Is a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. Long-term, of course, is fighting against the structural violence, which is making human beings more violent. I mean, the sense of injustice that we have probably makes us prone to violence. I mean, I always quote this story from Mahabharata when the war was almost to start. On the eve of that, Dhritarashtra invited Vidur and asked him that, why this war? And Vidur said that it is because there is no justice. He said, what do you mean by justice? He said, something that you don't want for yourself, you should not want for others too. So all such violence, I guess, do have certain kind of background. That is the feeling of being segregated, humiliated, feeling of injustice and all that. So we should not see violence in isolation. I think that's the point you made, that there is a structural basis of the violence, and therefore we must take that seriously. Second thing is that if there is a peace in society and there's a status quo along with very exploitative structure, we should not be very happy. We must disturb that exploitative structure. So Gandhi was not exactly a philosopher of peace, but he was a philosopher of war, peaceful war, in the sense that you have to transform your society. That is what the point you have made in your book, that transformating the conditions of living is extremely important. If you're not doing that, then you can't be Gandhian. You can't live with peace and the status quo. You have to change it. You have to transform everything. So, and you went to the extent of suggesting that there's a corporate terrorism. I mean, in India, we are seeing this. Go to the tribal belt. The Naxal area, what we call, is basically witnessing this corporate terrorism. And forget about that. Even the normal areas where the land grab movement by the multinationals is going on, there's a corporate terrorism in offing. And mostly we don't know how to respond to that, because they are very powerful. And there's no such Gandhian movement which is actually challenging them that in a big way. And even if that is done, the state is standing with the corporates. The state is not coming in the open, but from the background, it supports the corporates to take over the land. So these are the new issues that we are facing, no doubt about it. But let me focus on what is the most crude form of terrorism, and which is guided by sometimes even our commitment to our religion. So as Mark Juergens-Meyer has a very interesting book called Terror in the Minds of God. So what happens is that we justify the terror with the help of calling it a just war, and just war coming from our religion. So how would Gandhi respond to that? How would Gandhi engage with, as somebody wrote very interestingly, Gandhi's response to Gandhi in dialogue with Osama bin Laden. So imagine two of them are meeting. One would not reject Laden's perspective as a very interesting perspective that one has written about, that how there's a feeling of injustice in the Muslim world, Islamic world, due to the policies that US has adopted, both cultural hegemony and economic and political hegemony. So maybe it is a response to that. So when Gandhi is engaging with this kind of people who thinks that violence, or not only violence, terrorism is a means of politics. So the debate is between non-violence as a means of politics and terrorism as a means of politics. Which is more effective? And how would Gandhi convince this actor that the goal that you want to achieve, probably you can achieve better through non-violence means? Or imagine Gandhi is in Kashmir and talking to Kashmiri militants. I mean, the crisis is genuine, the political alienation is genuine. States' terror there could be genuine, the way army has taken over society for a long time. In that situation, how would Gandhi convince those people that, well, even if you're facing this kind of violent situation, your terrorist kind of response, terrorism as a means of politics, is bound to fail? What do you think Gandhi would argue in this kind of situation? I would like you to respond, then we can move on.
Oh, okay. Very good. One thing I can add that I didn't, and then address your point, but that's relevant under, you raised about the multi-dimensionality of violence and hence terrorism. What I didn't mention, but which is very important, is that this functions, the dimensionality functions not only on the cognitive or rational level of analysis that we tend to present, but for Gandhi, it's also functions on the pre-reflective, the emotional level. And there's so much work on that now, and it's relevant to all of your questions. For example, there's so much work now on trauma, how people carry all of the, in many cases, their family, their childhood trauma, that they're even often not aware of. Let's say domestic abuse, incest, rape. I mean, there are all these alcoholism, all these horrible things that happen to the child who's 2, 3, 4 years old, and the child cannot process it and just internalizes it or blames herself or himself for this. But they're carrying all this trauma that then affects how they relate to all things later in life. And this goes back, we have all this work now, how in terms of this trauma, it's also intergenerational. It goes back long before your particular biological life. And so if you're trying to understand, and I've had many experiences like this, why do some African Americans, many of my students going back to civil rights days and later, why do they not act sometimes in rational ways? Why do they do certain things that are so self-defeating, right? And then you begin to appreciate the trauma, the violence, the terror that has been passed on for 400 years, right? And that, and then shapes, in fact, how one responds. First of all, how one responds to fear, insecurity, lack of confidence, of well-being, but how that perspective greatly informs in the same way that when I look at India, if you look at, for example, Dalits, untouchables, and others, you have to make sense of what's happening. Often you have to go back, not to just how they were mistreated as servants, as in my experience in Benares, as rickshawwallas and others in their life, and how they died at an early age and suffered and all were beaten and so forth. But one has to go back to a long history that defines the world in which they were born, the basic structures and relations. So that is something. Now that in terms of Mahendranath's other points that he then raised about religion and just war, I find that Gandhi, it's very interesting with Gandhi. In my work, Gandhi always had a strong commitment to nonviolence. But if you go back, and many of the Hindu texts are not nonviolent. Many of the epics and others, it's amazing how violent they are and how violent the gods and goddesses often are. And what's remarkable is how Gandhi reinterpreted many of those texts to try to find a nonviolent message that 90% of devotees did not embrace over several thousand years. But for Gandhi, Gandhi was committed to nonviolence, but Gandhi seemed to accept the possibility of just war. And this was especially the case in South Africa. Gandhi, for many motives, some which to me were unworthy, such as impressing the British, how Indians were loyal, they were courageous, as part of the move towards greater respect and greater Indian independence in British colonialism, Gandhi basically participated in the Boer War, in the Zulu Wars, and and Gandhi recruited for the British for World War I. So Gandhi, even though he was nonviolent, he accepted at least there was some possibility of talking about just war. I think that all changed in Gandhi, especially by around 1927 and then later, where Gandhi, in terms of our topic, the way I presented it, may accept that violence is sometimes necessary in rare cases while upholding nonviolence. I think Gandhi finally rejected the option of any just war. War is always unjust. So how would Gandhi, in terms of terrorism, how would Gandhi relate to terrorists today? And that's the big challenge we have. And I know people working in Kashmir today who are Gandhians, and in Bihar and other places. It's a real struggle that they have. And so for Gandhi, I think, as you suggested, in relating, see, the problem for Gandhi is part of Gandhi would say terrorism is always wrong. A lot of people misinterpret Gandhi. Terrorism, violence may in rare cases be necessary, but it's never moral. Terrorism is never necessary. For Gandhi, it is always unjust, oppressive, evil, right? So he would never justify terrorism, but he would engage with terrorists as he did during his life. And the problem for Gandhi is, you see, on the one hand, he has the absolute truth perspective of nonviolence. On the other hand, Gandhi repeatedly advises others to follow the truth wherever it takes them, right? This perspectival, multifaceted approach. My truth may not be your truth. Okay, well, that sounds very tolerant, inclusivistic. In terms of the world today, very attractive. But what if the truth for the other is terrorism? Is Gandhi saying to the other, so, okay, I don't believe in terrorism, but it's the truth for you. So this is a struggle for Gandhi. He doesn't accept that. So what Gandhi, he wouldn't just dismiss the terrorist. He would feel the need in many contextual situations to engage in nonviolent resistance to the terrorist. He definitely, but at the same time, he would want to have an open-ended, dynamic dialogue with the terrorist. And he has many approaches, but as you know, one of the most interesting is he claims that the terrorists who think that they're being so radical, so revolutionary, actually are embracing the basic position they claim to be opposing. And so what he's saying is that the Indian terrorist, whether it was in London or in India or in Kashmir, they actually are mimicking the oppressor. They're accepting that worldview, that the ends justify the means, that, as Gandhi says, I don't want to replace the British, right, tiger or oppressor with an Indian oppressor.
That's right.
Words,
I think
with Indians who simply will exploit other Indians.
That's true. I think I would like to bring in Priya at this moment. You know, one of the things that Priya is trying to study is how the home state movement, that is the movement for having land for home, and which is the example is leading. It's the movement of extreme poor who don't have even space to make their homes. And this movement is a non-violent movement.
Yes.
A similar movement could become extremely violent, I guess. But this is extreme humiliation when you don't have any space of your own. So Priya, what do you think? What makes them remain non-violent despite that kind of agony and tension. Would you agree with Professor Douglas Allen, that the idea that Gandhi is trying to propagate, that you have to disturb the status quo, but disturb it without collateral damage, without killing the other, treat the other as yourself and have negotiations? And do you think that they have the hope that one day the Indian state, which is so much pro-corporate, would agree to this kind of demand? Would you see a potential in this kind of argument that Professor Allen is giving?
Okay. Yes, sir. I do agree with his argument, and moreover, the question that why both are working towards the same goal of achieving justice, basically. But then why is this movement non-violent and the other violent? What I have witnessed is that because of the two things that I consider very important. That first is the nature of power that this movement inherits. So non-violent in this movement about Ekta Parishad, which is a non-violent movement, it believes working with, power with, rather than power over. So it tries to cooperate, it tries to, bring everybody at a horizontal level rather than at a, rather than creating hierarchies or any kind of superiority or inferiority complex. So that kind of power which it, which it believes in is something which makes people as well as the state to be at the same level. And that's why I think so somewhere down the line, the non-violence becomes very, the belief in non-violence becomes very strong. The other thing is there are two things through which we can really disturb the status quo, disrupt the status quo. First is terror that Douglas Allen sir was also talking about. And the other is the moral pressure. And there is a subtle difference between these two. Terror also pressurizes, the state and the power nexus to, to really disrupt. But that terror brings the feeling of revenge as well. And it binds us in a vicious circle of violence. But when we talk about moral pressure, we are trying to remove that kind of hierarchy. We are trying to remove those kind of binaries between us and them. As a result of which, the revenge part doesn't exist, because nobody has to be revenged against. They have to be put together in a dialogue, and then we have to move forward. So this is the power of non-violence.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because the latter part of the title of the book, that creative non-violence. So you think this is creative non-violence, and it is important because it is more sustainable, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I would also question Douglas sir about it. That so please elaborate on what creative non-violence is. How do you think it manifests in reality? I have another question, but if you want, you can always respond to it, and I can ask the related question later, as you wish.
Okay, well, thank you for the really insightful comments, and and also emphasizing the moral pressure. And as you know, my approach is that Gandhi is primarily a moral thinker and practitioner. To me, this is, and there are a lot of very influential approaches, including some that are Gandhian, that completely ignore that dimension. They just say, well, Gandhi gives us the answers that are very pragmatic in a very narrow way. Gandhi is a pragmatist, but very narrow. In other words, you don't have to get into any of the moral or philosophical issues we're discussing. If you adopt a Gandhian approach, Gandhian techniques, you can show people that it works, right? You can show of people running prisons, was mentioned, that this is an effective way of diffusing the alienation and anger of prisoners. we have it in our country too. You can use certain Gandhian techniques in the military so that people will carry out their missions in a kind of calm attitude, with equanimity, without ego attachment. We can use when we have conflict resolution at our universities. We have angry students or workers. We can use Gandhian techniques, dialogue, to diffuse the anger and so forth. And so we don't have to get into any of the moral issues. And to me, such approaches, using Gandhi, which can be very effective, but often they don't raise the key things like, why are people angry? Why are they suffering? Why are those people poor? Why do, and maybe the goal is not simply to get them to readjust to the dominant status quo, right? So that they do not disrupt. For me, for Gandhi, that's a very violent approach. And the reason I emphasize creative nonviolence is, there are many reasons, but to me, it is part of a creative process. There are a lot of people who are proponents, Gandhian and many others I know, who are proponents of absolute nonviolence, and it's not creative. They just have the absolute truth. War is wrong, period. Violence is wrong, period, in every single case. And often they are very admirable human beings, and often they are really irrelevant when it comes to the kind of struggles that Gandhi had and that I think we all face. So for me, it's a creative process in which we are constantly, in other words, for example, even with regard to Gandhi, how we read Gandhi always involves rereading Gandhi. How we interpret him always involves reinterpreting him. How we appropriate always involves reappropriating him in all kinds of new creative ways, right? Learning from Gandhi, but also furthering the kind of nonviolent project. Because to me, we have no future in a violent terrorist world. And you see it environmentally now. If we simply continue, we're now at the tipping point. And if we continue the attitude we have towards land, towards non-human life, towards fossil fuels, I mean, it's suicidal. It's simply suicidal. And we have endless species are just becoming extinct. And unless we qualitatively change the way we live in new creative ways, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively, how we define what it is to be human, what it is to flourish, what it is to live a meaningful life, what is success, what is prosperity. I mean, unless we and Gandhi here is very creative in challenging us. And so to me, nonviolence only has possibilities of success. It's necessary for its success, but if we are dedicated to rethinking all of our relations, the origins of our root causes and structures of our violence and terror and terrorism, and reformulating them in new creative ways.
That's
and
right.
And I'm very hopeful.
I think the most challenging case for anybody who wants to do this kind of creative reading is one that Vipanchika is trying to think about, the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And Vipanchika has a proposal, and I would like her to put forward, and you would like her to involve you in that kind of discussion. Yes, please, Vipanchika.
Yes. So my research has been at the intersection of, like Sir said, studying both prisons as well as what is happening in Palestine. So I've come across something called as transformative justice, as we were discussing about non-violence. From this approach, it's the non-violent method that I think of is bringing about care and mutual aid into the public sphere, where in a smaller way we could make a difference, where instead of branding somebody as a terrorist or criminal, I think we could come across these inequalities that are, that you, like you said, are multidimensional, and we could have a sort of a solution, maybe which that comes out of the dialogue with these people. However, we can see how in Israel Palestine, especially, that the neoliberal institutions that basically give legitimacy to the state violence to be just continued in a way that we have been conditioned, even in the political theory, that state has monopoly over violence. So this kind of understanding, where the overt expression of it has been the military industrial complex, and later on we can see how I've been reading about the citizenship structure of Israel, where there is no mention of exclusion of an Arab or Palestinian per se from the citizenship structure. It's within the neoliberal framework where it just says that for the purposes of security, that we are going to not let a population who are there in this particular area, where there's no mention per se of somebody coming from a background. So in this case, I think it's first of all really unclear for even the people to locate where this terrorism is actually coming from. Is it even terrorism what Israel is doing? So the kind of ways that the governments have been following within this neoliberal framework is giving a sort of legitimacy from the side of people, because this is now the issue of security. So in that case, how do we understand the redefinition of terrorism, or is it even terrorism? What do you think, so that I will continue to perhaps have a dialogue with you?
Yes, and let me add to this. I think one of the issues that Gandhi was trying to think was, how do we negotiate between two communities which have feeling of insecurity vis-a-vis each other? I think that's what is really depicted in Israel-Arab conflict, where there is a sense of insecurity that if I do not do something, the other group will do something. So there is a kind of lack of communication, and probably Gandhian method of dialogue would have allowed them to sit together and open up their hearts to discuss about the insecurity and evolve a kind of political institution which could take care of their insecurities. I think this is something that we are witnessing even in India at this moment. The communities, the kind of politics there we're seeing now, the political class is using inter-community differences for its electoral gain. Now, and it is about all the entire political class. It's not about one group only. Somebody is doing little more, somebody is doing little less. But this is a very common thing that we can see, that between the communities, whatever the gap is there, they want to use that gap for the benefit of their electoral politics, which is furthering the insecurity, caste, class insecurity, and everything. Gandhi probably had this idea that these communities may have a sense of universal justice. Within that sense of universal justice, a dialogue would have been possible, a moral dialogue would have been possible, and to arrive on certain kind of political institutions where with transparency you could maintain a peace and development. I think that is where I would like Ellen to reflect upon. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. It was interesting that you kept talking about new liberal policies, because to me, the way I usually look at it, the Israeli policies under Netanyahu, under Likud, and so forth, have been increasingly far right and very little liberal. To me, the early administrations, leaders, prime ministers, parties in Israel tended to be more liberal, right, for decades. What you said, let me just say in perhaps an autobiographical way, because you'll be surprised. The most important formative thing in my whole life at that time was my participation in what was probably the largest Jewish youth group in the United States, which defined itself as a Zionist youth group. And I was the president of the largest region in the country, and I would have been the national president, except, well, because I got into Yale University, and where, coming from a very modest background, I had to work jobs, and I happened to have track. I spent tremendous amount of time running and other things. So I was unable to become the national president, but we spent countless hours as youth working on this, and we were very utopian. Our model was not an idealist. We never talked about anti-Palestinian. We were in many ways, we were very naive. And we were similar to the approach that Buber and Heschel and many others had, and many of the early founders. Our motto was the kibbutz, and it was back to the land, egalitarian, decentralized. It really was socialist in its democratic socialist model. And and we had this vision of Israel. It would be different from all other nations. There'd be no big military. There'd be no big state power. I mean, this was the view. And we had all of the rituals, we would get together often during the summer. Every day we'd have singing and dancing, and it was a communal sense that was a contrast to the individualistic, materialistic, upward mobile American life in the 1950s that we were rebelling against. So I say all of that because for me, it's been very painful over the decades to try to come to terms with these changing realities. You'll be surprised, in 1998, my sabbatical, I spent the fall in India. I spent the spring in Israel. And this was Israel's 50th anniversary. And it was right after Rabin had been assassinated by a far-right Israeli nationalist. And I worked with all the Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian peace groups. And I still work with a lot of them. And it was a very reflective period, 50 years later. What happened to that original vision of peace and justice? So I'm glad that you're doing what you are. It's very important to engage in that kind of dialogue. There are many groups that I'm in that are trying to do that under very different circumstances. The one thing I would just say in terms of dialogue that is painful is there's a very uneven hierarchical power relation here. In other words, Israel tends to, and by Israel, I mean the dominant narrative about insecurity and all this, but it tends to have so much of the military power, nuclear power. It's very advanced in technology, in science, in Tel Aviv is a modern, right? Western Mediterranean society, and so forth. So in relating to Palestinians in dialogue, you start out structurally, relationally, with a very uneven situation. And so in establishing authentics where you can try to deal with the mutual fear about insecurity, about terror and terrorism, you have to appreciate that from an Israeli point of view, you're going into that dialogue in a position of privilege. And how do you deal with that in establishing a more equal dialogue? And how do you work together in transformative ways to try to, and here Gandhi-informed approach can be very valuable in how you can work together in a creative, nonviolent way to try to create some nonviolent options for the future.
Yeah, I think I was just looking at some of the videos of a couple of schools in which and their young teachers having students, both Israeli and Palestinian students together, young children together, and trying to generate a shared experience of living. So such kind of experiments are very interesting. And I would call them Gandhian experience.
Yeah.
The method of training people in thinking through the other. I think something that Amartya Sen has been emphasizing in his article on Gandhi and terrorism. He says that probably we don't have, or Gandhi doesn't have short-term answer to the terrorism, but the long-term answer of redesigning education is definitely very important. And that's the Gandhian answer, to have common schooling system where children of all communities sit together and have common experience. I think that's very interesting experience. I think Vipanchika, I would like you to also talk about your anti-prison movement. I think Gandhi is one of the experiments about the prison that caught the imagination of some of the judges in 60s was that there should not be any prison, and we should try to keep the we should try to understand the sociology of the crime and design a certain kind of punishment, which is not prison. One should not be alienated from society, because the argument at that time was that reproduces the criminal mentality. It doesn't really reform the person. Right. So reforming the person is extremely important. So, and many of the terrorist acts, today's terrorist acts, actually emanate from there. The way they are handled by the state, the way when they were in prison, the kind of torture that the state has produced or has done on the body of the person, that also creates a lot of feeling of taking up violence against the state and against the people. So I would like Vipanchika to, in short, talk about that and get Ellen's response on this.
Yeah, well, I think it's true that when we have to start looking at prison, I think we should look first at the statistics that tells us how a certain section of population is indiscriminately represented. From there, I think we can deduce and understand the fact that these people are economically and socially neglected in the society. For example, in India, we see Dalits and Adivasis as and Muslims as predominantly representing in the under trial prisons, which shows the police bias. Whereas when they get convicted, the proportion of population is reduced, which shows that, you know, the way the state is organized is in itself has a structural bias towards certain section of population. I think this is where also the terroristic activities also come out. And it is not to really say that all those who are repressed will become terrorists per se, but it also, it can.
That's the breeding ground. It becomes a breeding ground.
It could be a breeding ground. Yeah.
Possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and instead of really dealing with these issues about economic and social injustices, and we directly take this higher level of approach where you directly punish them instead of redressing these issues, I think that's where the fault of the system keeps on reproducing. And this is also a kind of a cycle of violence where you keep the society in this constant state of influx where there's no solution at all to the
Yeah,
actual
yeah,
problems.
In fact, I would like to bring Priya also at this point, because I think that this Gandhian idea of peaceful movement against injustice that saves people from looking for individual solutions for the problems that they are facing. So one of the things that I think this is Erik Erikson's argument, that such great leaders, the difference between them and the common people is that they treat their personal agony or personal humiliation as part of the social problem. And therefore they know that unless you reform or you lead a movement against that at a collective level, the personal humiliation cannot be over. So this kind of movement that Priya is trying to study, I guess that has also channelized the energy, the anger, the anxiety towards a social transformation. I think that is Gandhi's primary concern, one of the primary concerns, that don't try to find individual solution to that. Have a collective to come together, make a collective and fight against injustice. I think these two things go very, very much simultaneously. So I would like, yeah, Priya, would you like to share your experience and then invite Ellen to?
So, yeah. So the thing is that we can, if I would rephrase what you have said, sir, I would think that Gandhi emphasized more on conflict transformation rather than on conflict resolution.
Yes.
It is because of this reason that, you know, we do not restrict ourselves at resolving the conflict, which may be individual or collective also. So the one thing is this. Second thing that I was thinking about while you were saying this is that how Gandhi focused on a holistic change rather than, you know, on an individual change. So even if he is talking about a social transformation, he's also talking about a political transformation, a political rising of a political consciousness. He's also talking about an economic transformation along with that. So that this seamless web of change, which transforms holistically, is very seems to be very important in Gandhi. Now, when I think about terrorist movements and this movement, non-violent movement that I am reading, I think one thing which I found also was where is this transformation leading them to? You know, is it leading them to you know, achievement of their goals, particular goals, or is it leading them to create further ripples of change? So I think somewhere down the line, the in terrorist movement or in violent movements, I see is that somewhere down the line, the focus is on achieving the end. And that's why, you know, we focus on the power of the means, you know, on the power of, say, guns or the weapons that they are using. But because non-violent movement focuses on people's power, it focuses on how to make these people as agents of change even after the goals have been achieved. So I think this is something which I would consider as, you know, a very important part of creative
So you are saying that the human beings involved in this kind of movement, they themselves get transformed, and that is extremely important.
Yes.
So then what Gandhian goal of creating a non-alienated society is possible, which will not produce violence in that case. I just want to add one more question for, you want to say something more, Priya?
Yeah, just one question that this leads me to always thinking about if there is a permanence of violence. Mostly we devote it to structural violence, you know, and I keep thinking, can there something as structural non-violence, which can really, you know, change the entire permanence of violence, that gives, you know, the entire legitimacy to violence, to non-violence. You did, you know, talk about it in your chapter about how education can be one of the agents. But are there other examples?
Very interesting. Maybe may I add something more? And Ellen, how do you think of all these things in the present context, where capitalism is moving to a new direction with growing AI and robotics, and maybe tomorrow it will not be dependent so much on the human labor, and the state will become much more capitalist and authoritarian I mean, I call it emergence of techno-authoritarian states. And the techno-authoritarian states are not sensitive towards human beings. In fact, these states are worse than the British colonial state. The British colonial state, I think Gandhi had this advantage of putting a sense of guilt in the British colonial power, that you are ruling India in most un-British way. So they could not have really done anything else except to really concede to Gandhi's argument. But today's capitalism and its friend, this techno-authoritarian state, will that be responding to this kind of thing that Priya is suggesting or Vipanchika is suggesting?
Okay. So I agreed with all of the very good points Priya was offering here, and which are consistent with how I approach Gandhi, and sometimes inconsistent with how some Gandhians approach Gandhi. So I welcome that, and the individual collective. There are a lot of interesting things we could say about that, but I was sympathetic to what was shared. Now, I'm glad you raised the question about structural nonviolence, because I realized that in my presentations focusing on violence, I often say, and the corresponding, right, in each case, points about nonviolence, but I'm talking mainly about violence, because we live in a violent world, and that's what I'm challenging and so forth. So what often is not emphasized, but is crucial to my approach, is structural nonviolence. And so I can say a few things. You cited the example of education that Gandhi cites and that I do it in a number of my writings. To me, structural nonviolence functions every day in billions of situations, in families, in communities, in neighborhoods, and during COVID-19, and all kinds of things. Usually the structural nonviolence never gets into the news. It's not what the media covers, but Gandhi would say it's the fabric that keeps us alive. Gandhi suggests that if we didn't have all of that structural nonviolence, we would have become extinct long ago. So those are the basic structures, for example, of care, compassion, love. The fact that when we experience someone else's suffering, whether it's a child, a parent, a neighbor, it touches us. We want to respond. No, this is part of, for Gandhi, what makes us human. In fact, what Gandhi says, it's our higher human nature, or our true human nature, not simply our brute nature, which is more the violent nature, that is also part of what it is to be human. So we have all of this structural nonviolence where people are resilient, where they do extraordinary things in normal everyday life, where they sacrifice their egos to serve the needs of people who are suffering. And we see this in our COVID, which has been, I'm sure in India too, I observe it every day in the US, but you wouldn't know it in the media. And if you look at the horrendous examples of the structural violence in India, where who have access to healthcare and who go to hospitals, who simply die and they're not even counted. They're not even counted. We're saying the numbers of deaths in India may be 10 times what the official government, the state, releases. and disproportionately poor people, rural people, people who live in, quote, slums, minorities, and so forth. So I would say that we have structural nonviolence, just that's part of our everyday world in which we live. When we talk about what is a good relationship, what is a loving relationship, what is even a friendship, right? It has to be structured by this kind of what we're talking about, this relational nonviolence. And then there are so many examples that Gandhi tells us about the structure, all those dimensions and sort that I raised of nonviolence, like part of the structural nonviolence is what kind of language you use. And I try to be very tolerant, I can say, because we have two young people, but I find it's partly my generation. And I try to be very tolerant and empathetic and understand. But a lot of my students, they use language that is so violent and coarse, where every sentence has the F word in it. And I say, okay, it's part of their music, it's part of their humor, it's part of their, but to me, in terms of my values, there's something, first of all, it's a kind of lazy language, right? It's but also to me, there's something violent about it. And it's a way that in this individualistic way, you're expressing yourself violently. So for Gandhi, it's very important with children, with all of your relation, what kind of language, because you linguistically can constitute structures of nonviolence, of care, of kindness, of selfless service, in which you don't reward violence as being the success, the individual, the Trumpian type individual who can simply impose their violent will on others. You don't reward that, just the opposite. You decondition those structures. And then every example that I raised of violence, we could talk about structural nonviolence. For example, just to give one last example, environmental. Right now, environmentally, we have structural violence. Gandhi says, and it's true, how we treat nature simply as an object, a means to our ends. We can do anything to nature to exploit nature. How we treat non-human life, how we treat, and for Gandhi, that kind of structural environmental violence, how we think of our relation. What is our relation as human beings? Like you said earlier, is it holistic? Is it reciprocal? Is it that we are nature, as our indigenous people here tell us all the time? We are nature. We learn from nature. We interact with nature. When we destroy nature, we destroy ourselves. Well, there's a basic structural understanding here that in terms of the need for structural nonviolence is really important. And I agree with what Mahendranath said at the end. And it's a real challenge for a Gandhian approach. If you look at what's happening in terms of capitalism, the military, the structures of the military, industrial, state, educational, complex, media complex, all this introduction of AI, this what you call this kind of authoritarian techno structure, the automation and expulsion of, and we see this is we're saying increasingly after COVID, we're going to find that lots of those jobs simply are eliminated. We now have robots, we have machines, we have things that don't have to put up with any disruption, protest, struggle. Well, what does this do for a Gandhian approach that is so based, in Gandhi's terms, on personal engagement, personal dialogue? How do you have dialogue with the CEO, with uh, the multi-billionaires and others who often they don't even live in the same country or the same continent? They make decisions that affect billions of people's lives, and they have no interest in engaging in dialogue with you. So the question is, I think Gandhi has a lot of important insights about the need for this decentralized, egalitarian, self-empowering, mutual kind of dialogue and struggle. But also we have to reconstitute those Gandhian values and say, okay, but how, even though it's not our main focus, how do we engage the state? How do we engage those largely impersonal corporations, global structures of globalization? Because simply to say, I know Gandhians who just say things like, globalization is wrong. It's anti-Gandhian. But we live in a world of globalization. And simply to take that position makes you irrelevant, right? So I think those are all good points you're raising.
So your mic is off.
Is
Thank you
off?
very much. Yeah, is it? No, it's fine, I think.
Okay.
So thank you very much. I think we had a lively discussion,
Yeah.
and we would like to now, Priya, should we now bring closer to this?
Yes,
So
I think we can.
yeah, so I must say that it was absolutely fruitful discussion, very insightful discussion. And I will end by saying what he says, actually, Ellen quotes Martin Luther King, that we have to change thing-oriented society into a person-oriented society. I think that is a very crucial Gandhian project. And that will actually challenge even capitalism. If we, and it is not only fighting against capitalism. Gandhi always used to say that the fight within is really much more serious than fight outside. Accessing the self gives us agency to fight against the outside enemy. I think, therefore, this changing thing-oriented society into a person-oriented society would be one of the projects for 21st century people who want to change, who want to bring any change. I think this Gandhi-informed society also gives me, Gandhi-informed perspective also gives me this idea that we should have our perspective Gandhi-informed, Marx-informed, Ambedkar-informed, and anybody who has thought about human liberation. I call them philosophers of liberation. We need to engage in a dialogue with them in order to create an informed perspective for 21st century. Neither Gandhi would do entirely, nor Marx would do without Gandhi, or neither Ambedkar will do without Gandhi or Marx. So I think there could be many more. I'm just taking 3 names. So anybody and everybody in the entire globe who has been thinking about universal human liberation from the point of their own struggle, we have to engage with them, extract those points, and create an informed perspective for fighting against the challenges that we are going to face in 21st century. I'm sure it's a wonderful evening, and I look forward for more such dialogues with Ellen, maybe in a bigger group. I have many more students who would like to engage from different angles on these issues. So maybe Vipanchika, one day we should invite Ellen to speak to our own classroom so that they can have, and Ellen will have, you will be able to read the young mind, how they are thinking. I think one of the most exciting thing for a professor is that he or she is engaging with the young mind and the way they are thinking. So it's really wonderful to have Ellen along with us. And I'm sure our dialogue will continue. And maybe one day there could be a kind of joint meeting of our group and the group that is existing in his university. So we can have a kind of exchange of ideas, how these younger people are thinking. Maybe somebody can kind of engage both the groups on certain issues that we have raised today. These are the proposals that I am offhand giving, but I'm sure Priya and Vipanchika will exchange more ideas with you and then plan something in future. Thank you very much. Priya, you have to bring this to a close.
This was indeed an insightful session, sir. Thank you so much for opening up so many avenues to think about. And, it was really thought-provoking. Now, I would request Vipanchika to please present a vote of thanks and conclude the session.
Yes, true, Priya. I mean, there's a lot more to discuss, and yet, since we have reached more than the stipulated time, I think we have to conclude our session. So I would like to present vote of thanks to our guest speaker, Dr. Douglas Allen, for accepting our invitation to the dialogue series. I would also like to thank Dr. Manindranath Thakur for moderating this session and guiding us throughout. And last but not least, I would like to thank the organizing team for their efforts for putting this session together. Let me just make an announcement to the viewers. To the viewers, we thank you very much for watching this intense dialogue. I request you to please post your questions in the comment section below. Stay tuned for our next session of this dialogue series on the theme, Nonviolence and Terrorism in 21st Century. Do also subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for further notifications. Thank you.
Let me just mention, I should have done it in the beginning. You will be very glad to know, Ellen, that the person who is making all this thing possible from behind, Abhay, is a filmmaker and a Gandhian. It is so exciting to think that a filmmaker is a Gandhian, and he is actually very, very happy to do all these things for us. And he is a thinker. And we didn't get time to engage with your idea on technology. Maybe in other discussion we'll engage between you. We'll see a dialogue between you and Abhay on the issue of technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ellen, you want to say something?
No, just thank you. I'm so glad you invited me, and from my point of view, it was a pleasure, and I enjoyed the session, and I hope the YouTube will generate a lot of discussion and questions, especially among the young people. Okay, so thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.